Some decisions in life force us to choose between honoring the past and securing the future. Today, we bring you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty, sacrifice, and the devastating consequences of betrayal. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a widow and devoted mother who made an impossible choice that would tear her family apart forever. What would you do if you had to sell your late father's most precious possessions to give your child a chance at their dreams? And what would you do if your own sister orchestrated the complete destruction of that sacrifice? Stay with us, because what happened next will leave you speechless. Sarah Mitchell never imagined her life would turn out this way. At 42 years old, she found herself navigating the cold, lonely waters of widowhood in the small town of Bardstown, Kentucky, where generations of her family had planted roots deep into the rich Bourbon country soil. The rolling hills and historic limestone buildings of her hometown had once brought her comfort, but after losing her husband, David, to a sudden heart attack 3 years ago, even the familiar streets felt like a foreign land. Bardstown was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the smell of aging bourbon drifted through the air on humid summer evenings, where the local diner still served coffee for $1 and gossip for free. Sarah had grown up here, learned to ride her first bicycle on these streets, attended the same high school her father had graduated from decades before. This town was in her blood, but lately it felt more like a cage than a home. Her father, Robert Harrison, had been a pillar of the Bardstown community. For over 40 years, he worked as a master carpenter, his calloused hands crafting everything from kitchen cabinets to intricate wooden sculptures that decorated homes throughout Nelson County. He was the man people called when they needed something built to last, built with integrity, built with soul. Robert didn't just work with wood. He breathed life into it, transforming raw lumber into heirlooms that families would treasure for generations. When Robert passed away from complications of pneumonia just 6 months after Sarah buried her husband, she felt as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her feet. First David, then her father. The 2 men who had been her anchors were gone, and she was left adrift with her 14-year-old daughter, Emma, who was struggling with her own ocean of grief. The estate was simple. Robert hadn't accumulated wealth, but he left behind something far more valuable to those who knew him: his workshop. Tucked behind his modest craftsman-style home on 3rd Street was a detached garage that had been converted into a carpentry shop. Inside, organized with meticulous care, were the tools of his trade: hammers worn smooth by decades of use, chisels sharp enough to shave paper, hand planes that had shaped thousands of board feet of lumber, table saws, drill presses, and lathes that hummed with the memory of his patient hands. Sarah's younger sister, Jennifer, had always been complicated. 2 years younger, and perpetually convinced that their father had favored Sarah, Jennifer grew up with a chip on her shoulder that only calcified with time. Where Sarah had inherited their father's calm, methodical nature, Jennifer burned with resentment that she tried to mask with sharp humor and passive-aggressive comments at family gatherings. The tension between the sisters had simmered for years, but it reached a boiling point after Robert's funeral. Jennifer made it clear that she believed the tools should be sold and the money divided equally. Sarah disagreed. She wasn't ready to let go of her father's legacy, not yet. Those tools weren't just wood and metal. They were Robert Harrison. They smelled like him, like sawdust and machine oil and hard work. Walking into that workshop was the closest Sarah could get to hugging her father one more time. But life had other plans. Emma, Sarah's daughter, had discovered a passion that burned brighter than anything Sarah had seen since David's death: horses. Specifically, competitive show jumping. What started as therapeutic riding lessons after her father's death had blossomed into genuine talent. Emma had a natural gift, an instinctive connection with horses that her instructor, Mrs. Patricia Holbrook, said she'd only seen a handful of times in her 30-year career. Emma wasn't just good, she was exceptional, and that distinction came with an opportunity that both thrilled and terrified Sarah. Mrs. Holbrook had connections to the Woodford Equestrian Academy in Lexington, one of the most prestigious riding programs in Kentucky. They had a scholarship program for talented young riders, but there were requirements: professional equipment, proper training gear, and most critically, a competition-grade saddle that would cost more money than Sarah had seen in her bank account since before David died. Sarah worked as a medical billing specialist at the Flaggett Memorial Hospital, a job that paid the bills but left little room for luxuries, let alone a $3,700 saddle. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom in the small ranch house she and David had bought when Emma was born, running the numbers over and over in her head. There was no path forward. No amount of budgeting or overtime shifts would generate that kind of money in time for Emma's evaluation in 3 months. Except there was one path. One terrible, heartbreaking path that led directly through her father's workshop. The autumn air in Bardstown carried a crisp edge that October morning when Sarah finally forced herself to open the door to her father's workshop. She had been avoiding this moment for weeks, but time was running out. Emma's evaluation at Woodford was scheduled for early January, and without the proper equipment, her daughter's chance would slip away like water through cupped hands. The workshop smelled exactly as it always had: sawdust, linseed oil, that particular scent of aged wood that permeated everything. Sarah flipped the light switch, and the fluorescent tubes flickered to life, casting harsh light over a space that had been frozen in time since her father's last day of work. A half-finished jewelry box sat on the workbench, forever incomplete. His favorite hammer rested where he had last set it down, waiting for a hand that would never return. Sarah moved through the space like she was walking through a sacred temple. She ran her fingers along the smooth handle of a chisel set her father had owned since before she was born. She picked up his leather work apron, still stiff with dried glue and wood stain, and held it to her face, inhaling deeply. For just a moment, she could almost believe he was still there. But he wasn't there. And Emma needed her mother to be strong, to make the impossible choices that parenting sometimes demanded. Sarah had done her research. She'd spent hours online, pricing vintage tools and carpentry equipment. She'd joined Facebook groups and forums where woodworkers bought and sold estate tools. She'd learned that her father's collection, meticulously maintained and including some rare vintage pieces from the early 20th century, could fetch serious money from collectors and professional craftsmen. The table saw alone, a vintage Powermatic from the 1950s, was worth over $1,000. The hand-plane collection, some dating back to before World War II, could bring in another $800. The lathe, drill press, and complete chisel sets would cover the rest. If she sold everything as a complete workshop package, she could get $3,800, maybe more. It would be enough for the saddle, with a little left over for Emma's competition fees. But it would mean letting go of the last tangible connection to her father. It would mean emptying this workshop and watching strangers load these tools into trucks and drive away. It would mean that her daughter's grandchildren would never see the tools that built half the cabinets in Bardstown. It would mean erasing a piece of Robert Harrison from the world. Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. She would lie in bed, exhausted but unable to quiet her mind, playing out scenarios. What would her father want? What would David have said? Was she dishonoring Robert's memory, or was she honoring it by investing in Emma's future? She finally found her answer one evening when Emma came home from riding lessons, her face flushed with excitement, talking a mile a minute about a new jumping technique she'd learned. Sarah watched her daughter, saw the light in her eyes, the pure joy that had been absent for so long after David's death. This was healing. This was life pushing forward, refusing to be defined by loss. That night, Sarah made her decision. She would sell the tools. She listed the collection on multiple platforms, describing each piece with the kind of detail that would attract serious buyers. She included photos of the organized workshop, the vintage labels still visible on some of the older tools, the proof of decades of careful maintenance. Within 2 days, she had an offer. A professional woodworker from Louisville, who specialized in restoration work, offered $3,800 for the complete collection. He would handle the pickup himself, treat everything with respect, continue using the tools in his craft. It was perfect, except for the part where Sarah's heart was breaking. She made the mistake of calling Jennifer to let her know about the sale. She thought naively that her sister might understand, that Jennifer might see this for what it was, a mother sacrificing for her child, the way their father had sacrificed countless times for them. She was wrong. Jennifer's response was immediate and vicious. How dare Sarah sell their father's tools without consulting her? How dare she put a price tag on their father's legacy? The tools should have been kept in the family, preserved, passed down. Sarah was being selfish, thinking only of Emma, dishonoring their father's memory for a spoiled teenager's hobby. The words cut deep, especially because they echoed Sarah's own doubts. But she pushed forward. She met the buyer, watched him carefully load each tool into his truck, accepted the cash payment of $3,800. She stood in the empty workshop after he left, surrounded by nothing but dust outlines where machines had stood for decades, and cried harder than she had since her father's funeral. But she had the money. And 2 days later, she drove to Lexington and purchased the saddle. It was a custom-made English jumping saddle, crafted by a renowned saddle maker in Italy. The leather was supple and perfectly balanced, the stitching immaculate. It was, in every way, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Her father would have appreciated the artistry. When Sarah presented the saddle to Emma, she didn't tell her daughter the full story. She simply said she'd been saving up, that this was an investment in Emma's future. Emma cried, hugged her mother so tightly Sarah could barely breathe, and promised to make her proud. For 2 perfect weeks, Sarah felt like she'd made the right choice. Emma practiced with the new saddle, her performance improving dramatically. Mrs. Holbrook was thrilled, confident that Emma would impress the evaluators at Woodford. Even the weight of the empty workshop seemed manageable when Sarah saw her daughter's happiness. Then Jennifer called to announce she was coming for dinner with her 3 children, Tyler, 13, Brandon, 11, and Mia, 9. Jennifer said she wanted to talk, to clear the air, to move past their disagreement. Sarah, desperate for family harmony, desperate to believe her sister could let go of her anger, said yes. The Saturday that Jennifer and her children arrived was unseasonably warm for November in Kentucky. The temperature had climbed into the low 70s, and Sarah had decided to set up their meal in the backyard. She'd spent the morning preparing her father's famous pulled pork, slow-cooked with a bourbon molasses glaze that had been a staple at family gatherings for as long as she could remember. It felt appropriate, a small way of keeping Robert's presence at the table even though his chair would remain empty. Emma had been thrilled about her cousins coming over. Despite the tension between Sarah and Jennifer, the kids had always gotten along reasonably well at family events. Emma, being the oldest, had a patient way with the younger children, often organizing games and activities that kept them entertained. She was particularly excited to show them her new saddle, which she'd been conditioning and caring for with the kind of devotion usually reserved for sacred relics. The saddle was gorgeous, there was no other word for it. Sarah found herself stopping sometimes just to look at it, hanging properly in the garage, on a saddle rack she'd purchased specifically for it. The Italian leather glowed with a deep, rich burgundy color, the brass fittings polished to a mirror shine. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each stitch perfectly placed, the seat molded to provide optimal balance for jumping. It was the kind of equipment professional riders used, the kind of saddle that would last Emma well into her adult riding career if properly maintained. Sarah had told Emma the truth finally, a week after purchasing the saddle. She explained about selling the tools, about the difficult choice, about why she'd done it. Emma had cried, understanding the weight of the sacrifice. She'd wanted to refuse the saddle, feeling it was too much, but Sarah had held firm. This was done. This was for Emma's future, and their grandfather would have understood. Jennifer arrived at 2 in the afternoon, her silver minivan pulling into the driveway with a crunch of gravel. Tyler tumbled out first, all long limbs and teenage awkwardness, glued to his phone. Brandon and Mia followed, immediately running toward the backyard where Sarah had set up the picnic table. Jennifer emerged last, wearing designer sunglasses and an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. The afternoon started pleasantly enough. The kids played cornhole, while Sarah and Jennifer worked on final meal preparations, making small talk about the weather, about Jennifer's job at the bank, about their mother's upcoming 70th birthday. The tension was there, simmering beneath the surface of every polite exchange, but Sarah hoped they could get through the day without incident. Emma showed her cousins around the property, proudly displaying the small vegetable garden she'd maintained since spring, the fire pit David had built years ago, and finally, with great ceremony, the garage where her saddle hung. Sarah was bringing out the coleslaw when she heard Emma's animated voice explaining the features of the saddle to her cousins. Through the open garage door, she could see Emma pointing out the details, explaining how the knee rolls were positioned for jumping, how the leather needed special conditioning, how much the saddle weighed, and why proper balance was critical for both horse and rider. Tyler looked bored, staring at his phone. Brandon seemed mildly interested. But Mia was paying attention, asking questions about the horse Emma rode, about what competitions were like. It was a sweet moment, exactly the kind of family connection Sarah had hoped for. Dinner was served at 3. Sarah had outdone herself, despite her limited budget. In addition to the pulled pork, she'd made her father's coleslaw recipe, bourbon-baked beans, cornbread from scratch, and her grandmother's peach cobbler for dessert. It was the kind of meal that had defined her childhood, the kind of spread that said family and home and belonging. They ate mostly in silence, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't openly hostile. Jennifer complimented the food, which Sarah took as a small peace offering. The kids ate with the single-minded focus children bring to good food, asking for seconds and thirds. Emma was radiant, clearly happy to have family around, to feel for a moment like their fractured family might heal. It was after dinner, while Sarah was cutting the cobbler, that things began to unravel. Jennifer made a comment, seemingly casual, about how nice it must be to have money for expensive hobbies. Sarah stiffened, but didn't respond. Emma, bless her heart, jumped in to explain that her mother had made a sacrifice to buy the saddle, that it wasn't frivolous spending, but an investment in her future. Jennifer's smile was cold. A sacrifice, she repeated. Yes, she'd heard about that sacrifice, selling their father's tools to buy sporting equipment. She was sure Robert would have been so proud. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut. Sarah felt her face flush, felt anger rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She would not fight with her sister in front of the children. She would not ruin this day. But Jennifer wasn't finished. She continued, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she wanted to wound. She talked about how some people always managed to be the favorite, how some people always got everything, while others were left with scraps. She talked about their father, about his workshop, about legacy and respect and family values. Emma excused herself, uncomfortable with the rising tension. The younger kids, sensing the shift in atmosphere, grew quiet and watchful. Tyler, still on his phone, seemed oblivious. But Brandon and Mia were paying attention now, watching their mother, with an intensity that made Sarah uneasy. Sarah finally spoke, keeping her voice level and calm. She said that she understood Jennifer was upset, but the decision had been made. The tools had been sold to someone who would use them and appreciate them. The money had gone to giving Emma an opportunity that could change her life. She'd made the choice she felt was right, and she'd make it again. Jennifer stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete patio. She said she needed to use the bathroom. She took her time, leaving Sarah and the children in uncomfortable silence. When she returned, her expression had shifted. The anger was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction. She announced they needed to leave, claiming Brandon wasn't feeling well. Sarah protested. They hadn't even had dessert, but Jennifer was insistent. She gathered her children quickly, herding them toward the minivan. Brandon and Mia seemed confused by the sudden departure. Tyler finally looked up from his phone, annoyed at being pulled away. As Jennifer buckled Mia into her booster seat, she looked back at Sarah standing confused on the front porch. Jennifer smiled, and it was not a kind smile. She said that family had a way of teaching important lessons, that people who didn't respect the past shouldn't be surprised when the present didn't work out the way they planned. Sarah had no idea what her sister meant. She stood in the driveway, waving awkwardly as the minivan pulled away, feeling unsettled but unable to pinpoint why. Emma came to stand beside her, equally confused by their relative's abrupt departure. They went back inside, packed up the uneaten cobbler, and tried to salvage what was left of the evening. It wasn't until the next morning that Sarah understood. It wasn't until Emma's scream shattered the peaceful Sunday silence that the true horror of Jennifer's visit became clear. Sarah was in the kitchen, making pancakes and trying to convince herself that yesterday's dinner hadn't been a complete disaster, when Emma's scream cut through the house like a knife. It was the kind of scream that every parent knows instinctively, the sound that bypasses thought and triggers immediate action. Sarah dropped the spatula and ran toward the sound, her heart already racing, her mind cycling through terrible possibilities. Emma was in the garage, standing frozen in the doorway, one hand covering her mouth, the other pointing at something Sarah couldn't yet see. Sarah pushed past her daughter and then stopped, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were showing her. The saddle was on the floor, not hung properly on its rack where it should have been, but thrown carelessly onto the concrete garage floor. But that wasn't the worst of it. That wasn't what had made Emma scream. The saddle was covered in mud, thick Kentucky clay mud that had been deliberately smeared across the carefully conditioned leather. The beautiful burgundy color was obscured beneath a layer of brown filth. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The saddle had been slashed multiple times. Deep cuts carved through the leather with something sharp, something like a knife or box cutter. The seat was destroyed, the leather peeled back to reveal the foam and structure beneath. The knee rolls had been hacked at, chunks of leather missing entirely. The stitching had been deliberately cut in several places, causing sections to separate and gape open. The brass fittings were scratched and dented as though someone had taken a hammer to them. Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. All the air left her lungs. Her vision swam. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare, some awful dream she would wake from at any moment. But it was real. Emma was crying now, ugly sobbing that shook her whole body. She kept saying no, no, no over and over, like she could refuse reality and make it change. Sarah knelt beside the destroyed saddle, her hands hovering over it but not touching, as if contact would make the destruction more real. Who would do this? When did this happen? The garage had been locked last night, she was sure of it. Wasn't she? Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand, and then, like ice water flooding her veins, she remembered. Yesterday afternoon, Jennifer using the bathroom. The kids unsupervised for 10, maybe 15 minutes, while she and Jennifer had cleaned up after dinner. No, that was impossible. Children wouldn't do something like this. Jennifer's children, her own nieces and nephew, wouldn't destroy something they knew was precious. Would they? Sarah pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed Jennifer's number. It rang 4 times before her sister answered, her voice groggy with sleep. Sarah didn't bother with pleasantries. She demanded to know if Jennifer knew anything about the saddle, about the destruction, about what had happened in her garage yesterday. There was a pause, too long, too calculated. And then Jennifer said, in a voice that was far too calm, far too controlled, that she didn't know what Sarah was talking about, but there was something else in her tone, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Sarah ended the call and immediately called the Nelson County Sheriff's Office. She reported the vandalism, describing the damage, explaining about her sister's visit the day before. The deputy who responded was sympathetic, but not hopeful. Property damage was difficult to prove without witnesses or surveillance footage. Did Sarah have cameras? She didn't. Had anyone seen anything? No. The deputy took photos, filed a report, but made it clear that unless there was concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Sarah thanked him mechanically, already knowing the report would go nowhere. It was Emma who found the first real evidence. While Sarah was talking to the deputy, Emma had wandered into the backyard, needing air, needing to escape the scene in the garage. She found it behind the tool shed, hidden hastily beneath some fallen leaves, a pocket knife. Not just any pocket knife, but one Emma recognized immediately. It was Brandon's. Jennifer had given it to him for his 11th birthday just 3 months ago, a Swiss Army knife, with his initials engraved on the side. The knife was covered in mud and had traces of burgundy leather caught in the blade. Sarah's hands shook as she picked it up, careful not to smudge any potential fingerprints. She called the deputy back, showed him what Emma had found. He bagged it as evidence, his expression growing more serious. But it was what happened next that confirmed everything. Sarah, her anger overriding her judgment, called Jennifer again. This time, she didn't ask. She accused. She told Jennifer about the knife, about Brandon's knife that they'd found with leather in the blade. She demanded the truth. Jennifer's response was chilling in its honesty. She laughed, actually laughed, and then she said that maybe the children had gotten a little carried away. But Sarah needed to understand that actions had consequences, that disrespecting their father's memory had consequences, that choosing a spoiled teenager's hobby over family legacy had consequences. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Jennifer was admitting it, not directly, but clearly enough. She'd put her children up to this. She'd encouraged them, maybe even helped them plan it. She'd brought them to Sarah's home under the pretense of reconciliation, and then she'd orchestrated the destruction of the one thing Sarah had sacrificed everything to provide for Emma. Sarah's voice was shaking when she asked how Jennifer could do this, how she could use her own children as weapons, how she could be so cruel, so vindictive, so utterly heartless. Emma's future was on the line. That saddle had represented Sarah's father's tools, his legacy transformed into opportunity for his granddaughter, and Jennifer had destroyed it out of spite. Jennifer's response was even colder than Sarah expected. She said that Sarah had destroyed their father's legacy first, that she had sold Robert Harrison's life's work for a piece of leather and metal, that she had chosen wrong, and now she was learning what it felt like to lose something precious. The saddle could be replaced. Their father's tools could not. Sarah had made her choice, and Jennifer had made hers. Sarah hung up the phone. She looked at Emma, whose face was blotchy from crying, whose eyes held a mixture of grief and betrayal that no 14-year-old should have to experience. She looked at the bagged knife, at the photos the deputy had taken, at the destroyed saddle still lying on the garage floor like a murdered thing. And Sarah realized that this wasn't over. This couldn't be over. Jennifer had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had taken something that couldn't be taken back, and she had done it using children, her own children, as instruments of revenge. The deputy, before he left, gave Sarah the name of a lawyer who handled civil cases. He said that with the knife as evidence, with the admission Jennifer had made over the phone, Sarah had grounds for a civil suit, property damage, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Depending on how she wanted to proceed, she could seek damages. Sarah took the card, even though the thought of suing her own sister made her feel sick. She thanked the deputy and walked back into her house, where Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The pancakes Sarah had been making were still on the stove, burnt and forgotten. Mother and daughter sat together in silence, both trying to process what had happened, both trying to understand how family could betray family this thoroughly, this cruelly. Emma finally spoke, her voice small and broken, asking if the saddle could be repaired. Sarah gently explained that it couldn't. The damage was too extensive. The structural integrity was compromised. Even if they could patch the leather, which would cost almost as much as a new saddle, it wouldn't be safe to use in competition. It was, for all practical purposes, destroyed. Emma asked the question Sarah had been dreading. She asked if there was any way to get another saddle before her evaluation in January. Sarah had to tell her daughter the truth. No, there wasn't. The money was gone. The tools were gone. There was no path forward, not anymore. And that's when Sarah made her decision. Jennifer wanted consequences. Jennifer wanted to teach lessons about respect and family and legacy. Then Jennifer was about to learn a lesson herself. Sarah picked up the lawyer's card and, with Emma watching, made the call to schedule a consultation. If her family was already broken, if Jennifer had already chosen destruction over reconciliation, then Sarah would see this through. She would take her sister to court. She would fight for the $3,700 Jennifer's children had destroyed. She would fight for justice, even if it cost her what was left of her family. Because some betrayals couldn't be forgiven. Some wounds couldn't heal. And some choices, once made, defined everything that came after. The lawyer's office was in downtown Bardstown, in one of the historic buildings along North 3rd Street that had been standing since before the Civil War. Sarah sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to control the trembling that seemed to have taken permanent residence in her body. Emma had wanted to come, but Sarah had insisted she go to school. At least one of them should try to maintain some normalcy. The lawyer, Margaret Chen, was a woman in her mid-50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah found oddly comforting. She listened to Sarah's story without interruption, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, her expression growing more serious as the details emerged. When Sarah finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and delivered her assessment with the kind of blunt honesty Sarah had come to appreciate. The case was solid. Sarah had documentation of the saddle's purchase and value. She had the police report. She had photographs of the damage. Most importantly, she had the knife with Brandon's initials, found at the scene with leather residue on the blade. And she had Jennifer's admission, vague as it was, captured on Sarah's voicemail when Jennifer had called back later that evening to deliver a rambling, barely coherent message about family lessons and respect. Margaret explained that Sarah could file a civil suit in Nelson County Circuit Court, seeking damages equal to the cost of the saddle, plus additional compensation for emotional distress. The knife with Brandon's initials was damning evidence. Jennifer's admission, even indirect, strengthened the case considerably. Margaret believed they had better than even odds of winning a judgment. But, and Margaret emphasized this strongly, winning a judgment was not the same as winning. Even if the court ruled in Sarah's favor, even if Jennifer was ordered to pay, there was no guarantee Sarah would ever see that money. Jennifer could appeal. She could declare bankruptcy. She could simply refuse to pay and force Sarah into years of additional legal action to collect. And all of that was assuming Sarah was prepared for the collateral damage this lawsuit would cause. Sarah asked what kind of collateral damage Margaret meant. The lawyer's answer was uncomfortable, but honest. Family lawsuits were nuclear weapons. They destroyed relationships, often permanently. Sarah's mother would be forced to take sides. Extended family would be drawn into the conflict. Holidays would become battlegrounds. Children would grow up knowing that their mother sued their aunt, that their cousins had destroyed their property. The entire family structure would fracture, and there was no putting that back together. Sarah listened to all of this and asked a single question. What was the alternative? Let Jennifer get away with it? Teach Emma that family could destroy your dreams without consequence? Absorb a $3,700 loss when she was barely keeping her head above water financially? Accept that Jennifer's vindictive cruelty was just something to be endured? Margaret didn't have a good answer for that. She simply said that Sarah needed to be certain, because once they filed the lawsuit, there was no going back. The die would be cast, and Sarah would have to live with whatever consequences followed. Sarah signed the retainer agreement that afternoon. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. Jennifer was served with papers at her home in Lebanon Junction, a small community about 30 minutes from Bardstown. According to the process server, Jennifer had turned pale when she read the complaint, had asked if this was some kind of joke. When informed it was very real, she'd slammed the door without signing the receipt, requiring the server to leave the papers and depart. Jennifer's response came swiftly and vindictively. She hired her own lawyer, a combative attorney from Elizabethtown with a reputation for scorched earth tactics. Her answer to the complaint was a masterpiece of deflection and counter-accusation. She denied that her children had damaged the saddle. She claimed Sarah had damaged it herself for insurance fraud or sympathy. She filed a countersuit for defamation, claiming Sarah had damaged her reputation by accusing her and her children of criminal behavior. But more than that, Jennifer went nuclear on the family. She called their mother, their aunts and uncles, cousins scattered across Kentucky. She told everyone her version of events. Sarah had disrespected their father by selling his tools, then had tried to frame Jennifer's innocent children for vandalism when the saddle was accidentally damaged. She painted herself as the victim, the grieving daughter who wanted to preserve their father's legacy, being attacked by a sister who cared only about her spoiled daughter's expensive hobby. The family civil war began in earnest. Sarah's mother, Louise, called her in tears, begging her to drop the lawsuit. Family didn't sue family, she pleaded. Whatever had happened, whatever the truth was, this wasn't the way to handle it. They needed to sit down, talk it out, find some middle ground. Sarah tried to explain, but Louise wasn't hearing it. She said that Sarah was tearing the family apart, that Robert would be ashamed. That last comment cut deeper than anything Jennifer had done. Sarah had sacrificed her father's tools to help her daughter, and now his own widow was saying he'd be ashamed of her for seeking justice when those tools' replacement was destroyed. The irony was cruel enough to choke on. The case moved forward through the glacial pace of the civil court system. Discovery was contentious. Jennifer's lawyer demanded Sarah's financial records, trying to prove she couldn't afford the saddle and therefore must have obtained it fraudulently. Sarah's lawyer countered by subpoenaing the knife, which had been returned to Sarah after the police investigation went nowhere. Forensic analysis confirmed that the leather residue on the blade matched the saddle's leather composition. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Mia, Jennifer's 9-year-old daughter, told her teacher about the bad thing that happened at Aunt Sarah's house. The teacher, concerned and following mandatory reporting protocols, contacted the school counselor. Mia, in the safe environment of the counselor's office, told the whole story. She said her mother had been angry about Grandpa's tools. She said Brandon and Tyler had been talking about how Aunt Sarah deserved to be taught a lesson. She said her mother had told them where the saddle was, had made sure the garage door was unlocked, had kept Aunt Sarah busy while the boys went out there. She said Tyler had held the saddle while Brandon cut it with his knife. and that she'd been the one to smear mud on it because she was too scared to use the knife. She said her mother had seemed happy about it afterward, had told them they'd done the right thing, that Aunt Sarah needed to understand what it felt like to lose something precious. The school counselor, ethically bound to report suspected child abuse or endangerment, contacted Child Protective Services. Using children to commit vandalism and property destruction could be considered a form of emotional abuse, exposing minors to criminal liability for adult grievances. CPS opened an investigation. When Sarah learned about this development from Margaret, she felt sick. She hadn't wanted to hurt Jennifer's children. They were victims in this too, manipulated by their mother's rage. But there was no stopping it now. The machinery of the legal system and social services was in motion. The case went to trial in Nelson County Circuit Court on a cold February morning. The courtroom was small, intimate in a way that made the proceedings feel even more personal and devastating. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, Margaret beside her, and watched Jennifer sit at the defense table, her lawyer whispering instructions. The trial lasted 2 days. Margaret presented the evidence methodically: the purchase receipt for the saddle, the police report, photographs of the damage, the knife with Brandon's initials, and the forensic analysis. She called Emma as a witness, who testified tearfully about finding the destroyed saddle, about her dreams of competing at Woodford, about the sacrifice her mother had made. But the most devastating testimony came from Mia. The court had appointed a guardian ad litem to represent the children's interests, and with that guardian present, Mia testified via closed-circuit video. She told the truth, the whole truth, in the straightforward way that only a 9-year-old can. She described how her mother had been angry about the tools, how she'd told the boys to teach Aunt Sarah a lesson, how they'd snuck into the garage while the adults were distracted. Jennifer's lawyer tried to discredit the testimony, suggesting that Mia had been coached or was confused. But the little girl was consistent, detailed, and heartbreakingly honest. She even said she was sorry, that she knew it was wrong, but her mother had said it was okay, that Aunt Sarah deserved it. Jennifer took the stand in her own defense, and it was a disaster. Under cross-examination, she couldn't maintain her composure. She insisted she'd never told her children to damage the saddle, but she couldn't explain why Mia would lie in such detail. She claimed Sarah had always been the favorite, that selling their father's tools was an unforgivable betrayal, that she'd been driven to desperation by her sister's selfishness. Margaret, with surgical precision, walked Jennifer through her own words. The voicemail messages, the comments about consequences and lessons. Jennifer's face grew red, then pale, then red again. She tried to explain that she'd meant something different, that her words had been taken out of context. But the more she talked, the deeper she dug her own grave. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years, listened to everything with an impassive expression. When both sides rested, she took less than an hour to deliberate before returning with her ruling. The judge found in Sarah's favor. She stated for the record that the evidence was overwhelming. Jennifer had orchestrated the destruction of Sarah's property, using her minor children as instruments. The saddle, valued at $3,700, had been deliberately destroyed in an act of revenge. Jennifer was ordered to pay Sarah $3,700 in compensatory damages, plus an additional $2,500 in punitive damages for the particularly malicious nature of the act. Additionally, Jennifer was ordered to pay Sarah's legal fees, which had mounted to nearly $4,000. Total judgment, $11,200. Jennifer's face went white. Her lawyer immediately announced they would appeal, but the judge cut him off. She said that while they had the right to appeal, she was issuing the judgment immediately and would not stay enforcement pending appeal. Jennifer had 60 days to pay or face wage garnishment and liens on her property. But the judge wasn't finished. She addressed Jennifer directly, removing her reading glasses and fixing her with a hard stare. She said that using children to commit acts of revenge was unconscionable, that exposing minors to criminal liability to satisfy adult grudges was a form of child abuse. She noted that CPS had already opened an investigation and suggested strongly that Jennifer seek counseling for herself and her children. Then she dismissed court. Sarah walked out of the courthouse feeling hollow. She'd won. The judgment was clear and enforceable. Jennifer would have to pay, one way or another. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something that could never be rebuilt. The family damage was catastrophic and immediate. Sarah's mother, Louise, stopped speaking to her entirely. She told relatives that Sarah had destroyed the family, had taken her sister to court over money, had caused Jennifer's children to be investigated by social services. Never mind the truth. Never mind what Jennifer had actually done. In Louise's narrative, Sarah was the villain. Cousins took sides. The family's annual 4th of July reunion was cancelled because the organizers couldn't figure out how to invite some people without inviting others. Thanksgiving became impossible to navigate. Christmas was a patchwork of separate, sad celebrations rather than the large, chaotic gatherings that had defined Sarah's childhood. Emma's relationship with her cousins was destroyed. Tyler refused to speak to her at school. Brandon transferred to a different school district. Mia, traumatized by the whole ordeal and the CPS investigation that followed, required therapy. The therapist's notes, which later became part of the CPS file, indicated that Mia felt tremendous guilt for telling the truth and had internalized the message that honesty destroyed families. Jennifer paid the judgment, but only after her wages were garnished, and she was threatened with liens. The money came in bitter installments over 6 months. Each payment arrived with a note, sometimes just a single word: satisfied, or happy now, or worth it. Sarah used the money to purchase a new saddle for Emma, not as expensive as the original, but functional, professional-grade equipment. Emma's evaluation at Woodford had been postponed, but she was rescheduled for late spring. She performed well enough to earn a partial scholarship, though not the full ride that might have been possible with more time to prepare with proper equipment. Emma competed in several events that summer, placing respectably but not exceptionally. The joy she'd once found in riding was muted now, shadowed by everything that had happened. She understood, in the way teenagers understand complex adult situations, that her dream had cost her mother more than just money. It had cost her family, her peace, her sense of belonging. Sarah and Emma had dinner one evening in August, sitting on their back patio as the sun set over the Bardstown Hills. Emma asked her mother the question that had been hanging between them for months. Had it been worth it? All of it? Selling the tools, buying the saddle, the lawsuit, the family destruction? Looking back, knowing how it all turned out, would Sarah make the same choices again? Sarah was quiet for a long time, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance across the yard. Finally, she said that she didn't know. She'd made the choices she thought were right at the time, each decision leading to the next, like links in a chain. She'd sold the tools to give Emma an opportunity. Jennifer had destroyed that opportunity out of spite. Sarah had sought justice because the alternative was teaching her daughter that family could hurt you without consequence. But justice, Sarah said, wasn't the same as healing. Winning wasn't the same as being whole. She'd gotten her money back, but she'd lost her family. She taught Emma about standing up for yourself, but she'd also taught her that sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing alone. Emma asked if Sarah thought Grandpa Robert would understand, if he'd be proud or ashamed of what Sarah had done with his tools, with the money they'd brought, with everything that came after. Sarah thought about her father, about his calloused hands and patient smile, about the way he'd taught her to measure twice and cut once, to take her time and do things right. She said that her father had been a man who believed in building things that lasted, in craftsmanship and integrity. He'd worked hard so his daughters could have opportunities he never had. She wanted to believe that he'd understand that she'd tried to do the same for Emma, that she'd transformed his tools into her daughter's opportunity. But she also knew that Robert Harrison had valued family above almost everything. He'd mediated countless arguments between his daughters, always pushing for reconciliation, always believing that family was worth fighting for, not fighting against. Would he have supported Sarah's lawsuit? Would he have wanted his legacy to be the catalyst for family destruction? Sarah told Emma that she'd never know the answer to that question, and she'd have to live with that uncertainty. She'd made her choices in good faith, trying to do right by her daughter, trying to seek justice when that doing right was destroyed. Whether those were the right choices, whether her father would have approved, whether the outcome was worth the cost, those were questions without clear answers. What Sarah did know was this. She'd taught Emma that sacrifice was sometimes necessary, that mothers would move heaven and earth for their children. But she'd also taught her that families could be brittle, that blood ties could break, that sometimes doing what felt right led to outcomes that felt all wrong. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. She said that she understood, that she didn't blame her mother for any of it, that whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Mother and daughter sat together as darkness fell over Bardstown, two people who'd learned that love sometimes requires impossible choices, and that those choices leave scars that never fully heal. Sarah later visited her father's grave, something she'd been avoiding since the lawsuit concluded. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning, mist rising from the ground as the sun burned through. She stood at Robert Harrison's headstone, reading his name and dates, the simple inscription, "Beloved Father and Craftsman." She told him everything, about the tools, about Emma's dream, about the saddle and its destruction, about the lawsuit and the family fracture. She told him she'd tried to honor his memory by investing in his granddaughter's future, but that investment had cost more than she'd ever imagined. She asked him, knowing no answer would come, if she'd made the right choices. The morning was silent, except for birdsong and the whisper of wind through the cemetery trees. Sarah stood there for a long time, waiting for some sign, some sense of forgiveness or approval or understanding. None came. There was just the silence, the stone, and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Sarah finally spoke one last time to her father's grave. She said that she couldn't change what had happened, couldn't unmake her choices or Jennifer's choices, or the cascade of consequences that had followed. All she could do was keep moving forward, keep being Emma's mother, keep trying to build something good from the ruins of what had been destroyed. She said that she hoped, wherever he was, he understood, that he knew she'd done her best in an impossible situation, that he knew she'd never wanted to hurt anyone, never wanted the family to shatter, that his tools had become his granddaughter's saddle, had become a court judgment, had become a family permanently divided. That legacy, she said, was complicated and messy, and nothing like the clean, beautiful things he used to build in his workshop. Sarah left the cemetery as the sun fully rose, casting long shadows across the grounds. She drove home to make Emma breakfast, to help her daughter prepare for another day of practice, to continue the work of living with choices that had no clear right or wrong answers. She'd sought justice and found it, but the price had been higher than any dollar amount could measure. And she'd spend the rest of her life wondering if the cost had been worth it, knowing she'd never have a clear answer to that question. This is where Sarah Mitchell's story brings us to a crossroads of conscience. A mother who sold her late father's precious tools to afford her daughter's dream. A sister who orchestrated the destruction of that dream through the hands of children. A lawsuit that brought financial justice but destroyed family bonds that had existed for generations. There are no easy answers here, no clear heroes or villains, only flawed human beings making choices under impossible pressure. We want to hear from you. Put yourself in Sarah's position for a moment. Your father has passed, leaving behind his life's work. Your child has a chance at their dream, but it requires sacrificing that inheritance. Would you make the same choice Sarah made? Would you sell those tools? And when that sacrifice was destroyed by your own family, would you have the strength or the conviction to take them to court? Is justice worth the price of family? Can a family that would do such a thing even be worth preserving? And what about Jennifer? Yes, what she did was unconscionable, using her children as weapons in an adult conflict. But was her pain completely invalid? Is there a point where someone's grief and sense of betrayal, even if misdirected, deserves some understanding? Where do we draw the line between seeking justice and seeking revenge? These questions don't have simple answers, and that's exactly why we're asking you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about your own family conflicts, your own impossible choices, the times when doing what felt right led to outcomes that felt all wrong. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and what you believed was right? How did it turn out? What would you have done differently? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of your own family struggles, do us a favor. Subscribe to this channel. We bring you real stories about real people facing impossible situations, stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, sacrifice, and justice. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that matters. And before you go, check out our next recommended video, where we explore another family torn apart by choices that seemed right at the time, but led to devastating consequences. These are the stories that remind us that real life is messy, complicated, and rarely has the clear-cut endings we wish for. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community where we explore the difficult truths about family, sacrifice, and the prices we pay for our choices. We'll see you in the next video.